On the brink of war, the breakdown starts now. Good evening and welcome to The Breakdown. I'm Tara Setmayer. This is the Rick Wilson. And no, he was not laughing at the prospect of war. He was laughing at the fact that Tiki meowed as we were starting the show. And welcome, everyone. And Tiki says hello, too. Rick, we've got a big show tonight, man. There's a lot going on. We're switching gears a little bit to focus on the foreign policy space because what's happening over in Ukraine is really significant. And for some folks, it might be like, why do we care? That's way over there. Well, we have a great guest tonight. John Cypher is a former CIA station chief in Russia and spent 28 years in the clandestine services. The clandestine services are the spies. So John Cypher is an expert on what's happening over there, and he's joining us in a little bit. So make sure you stay tuned for our interview with him. It's going to be a great conversation. But before we get into that, we got a couple of housekeeping notes, Rick.
Indeed.
Well, first off, I debuted my first NBC Think op-ed piece today for NBCnews.com. Thank you. It's about Mike Pence, one of our other insufferable jerks that we don't like. And it's about Mike Pence's prospects at 2024. There's a familiar line in there to folks who watch this program where I say that Tiki has a better chance of becoming president of the United States than Mike Pence. So
imagine an infinite plane of dust and blowing tumbleweeds for all eternity before you. That's Mike Pence's future in Republican politics.
Pretty much. And so if you want to read more, go to NBC Think and check it out. Thank you. And Rick, you and Reed, you guys have an extra fuck around and find out tonight on Instagram Live. So if you guys want more of Rick and Reed tonight after the show, 8 o'clock, Instagram Live, go hang out with Reed and Rick over on IG. And we're going to do our Black History moment before we get into Ukraine, because I think it's important to recognize some of these historic figures that some folks have probably never heard of. So in the theme of foreign policy, we are going to talk about two folks tonight. First up is Ralph Bunche. He was one of the most prominent diplomats in U.S. history. He also was one of the founding members of the UN. He helped draft the charter for the United Nations and played a huge role in the creation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a really important international document. And he also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950, only 6 years after joining the State Department. Pretty accomplished guy and thankful for his work. And then we have a female in the foreign policy space, the first Black female ambassador. And she was the first U.S. envoy. It wasn't until 1965, Patricia Roberts Harris. She was appointed by Lyndon Johnson. And she said, she had a really meaningful quote. She said, "If my life has any meaning at all, it is that those who start out as outcasts can wind up as being part of the system." So two important historical figures in the foreign policy space for the United States. All right, that's it for our Black History moment. Couple of headlines before we bring in John Cypher. Rick, do you want to? I think we should debut our new segment. We have a new segment, folks.
We do.
And it's something that you hear Rick say often. You'll hear Reed say it if you listen to the podcast. I hope you do. And I say some version of it at times. But we are really, really, really sick of being right. What are we sick of being right about tonight? Well, it appears that our predictions about Kevin McCarthy being speaker, if God forbid the Republicans take over the House again, seem to be correct. Because guess who's saying he'll never be speaker? Lou Dobbs now. Now, most people might think Lou Dobbs is some crank that's over there on those wacky channels and got kicked off Fox Business because of the wacky things he says, but he is plugged in to the Republican base, into MAGA world. And where did he make those comments? Put it back up there. I want to read what his comments were. Lou Dobbs said this was on Matt Gaetz' podcast. Lou Dobbs says there's no way Kevin McCarthy should be speaker if the GOP retakes the majority, and that that only the, quote, brightest conservatives should be considered like Jim Jordan and Matt Gaetz. Rick Wilson, how many times have we said this?
Look, I was going back today and thinking about that, and I have to say, I think we've probably talked about the fact that a very large MAGA majority is going to be in control of the House, and they hate Kevin McCarthy. Mm-hmm. They don't think he's pure enough. So you will get someone like a Jim Jordan or a Paul Gosar or a Marjorie Taylor Greene or a Matt Gaetz if he's not in jail. That will take that job. And why buy MAGA light when you can have the pure, unadulterated, straight smack right from Mar-a-Lago?
And then there's always the talk of they could nominate Donald Trump to be Speaker of the House, because you don't have to be a member of the House of Representatives to be Speaker. A little fun fact. So
if that happens, by the way, the degree to which things are going to get loose is unimaginable.
Oh, even uttering that is unimaginable. I can't imagine. But you know what? There may be people. I forgot who was it. Gaetz? Somebody said that they were going to nominate Trump if they take back the House. It was Gaetz, right? Yeah. That's like his selling point. Vote for us so we can bring on Donald Trump back in to do no work. Crazy. He couldn't have anyway. But so yeah, there's that. So look forward to our predictions when we're sick of being right, popping up here and there on the show, because I suspect this will not be the last time. Something else that won't be the last time. So I've started doing this NPR show called Left, Right, and Center. And they have you ever listened to it? It's pretty cool. The episode comes out tomorrow. I taped it today. And they allow you to have a rant at the end of the show for like less than a minute. And my rant was actually about the January 6th committee, but kind of in a good way, because obviously we're happy now with the pace that they're working at, like everything that's going on, all of the information coming out. We have public hearings to look forward to. However, what I was ranting about today, I'm sick of every single time they issue a subpoena that there's a push alert. There's been dozens upon dozens of subpoenas now. Okay, fine, but it doesn't mean shit if they don't show up and testify. So I'm tired of the stop putting out a breaking news alert every time they issue a subpoena, because I think it dilutes people's interest in the importance of the work.
I say this a lot, Tara. I say this a lot. Excuse me. I'm going to have to step up and take care of a dog here in a minute.
That's okay. Tiki's around here too, so I suspect we're going to get a woof and a meow.
The idea that you have to have a spectacle to attract the American people's attention. This is the Super Bowl of democracy, folks. This is a big show. Make it a big show. I mean, you need these people under the lights. You need the drama. You need to make the whole thing sing. And you need to make sure that these people, when they're under the lights, that you are not pulling your punches, that you're not soft pedaling anything, that you are holding them to account.
Yes.
And with that, I'm going to go let this dog into this room. So
go
at the gate.
Go right ahead, because this is a good time for us to run our ad and transition over. And I agree with Rick about that too. That's why I said stop with the push notifications every time you guys subpoena someone. It is the Super Bowl of democracy here, the January 6th committee, and we want the American people engaged. We don't want them tuning out saying, oh, we're not going to learn anything, or we already heard this 20 times. No. So, all right. Let's transition a little bit to foreign policy and get on to our topic of the evening. This week, LP has really been focused on what's happening in Ukraine, how this impacts democracy, not just home, but abroad too. And this is just a larger narrative about the attack on Western-style democracy coming from authoritarian regimes like Putin. China's a different story. Hopefully we won't have to talk about them doing anything to Taiwan anytime soon, but that even has implications with what's happening with Ukraine. So I wanted to show you, if you haven't seen it yet, one of the newest ads LP has put out. It's called Twilight, and it's about other presidents who have stood up to this type of authoritarianism, except for one. Take a look.
For 70 years, Americans stood the watch for freedom in the twilight struggle against the evils of the Soviet Union. From Truman to Ike, and from Kennedy to Reagan, American presidents faced down Soviet oppression, stood strong for the values of liberty and freedom. Today, Putin's corrupt regime is poised to invade Ukraine.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan saying a Russian invasion could happen any moment now.
The Ukrainians will fight and fight hard to defend their nation from Russian aggression. They're not asking America to fight for them, just to stand behind their battle for freedom. By refusing to give in to Putin's threats and demands, President Biden is showing the same strength John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan once did.
If he moves on Ukraine, the economic consequences are going to be devastating.
America, once again, stands for freedom.
And with that, the Rick Wilson is back.
The dog has been let into the area. It will now misbehave.
That's all right. We welcome the pets. You want to give any background on what made you guys decide to do that ad now?
Absolutely, Tara. And I will say this. We're talking about, and I'm in the before the show started, I was in the middle of this fairly long tweet storm about this ad and the ad campaign and why it's so important. Right now, Vladimir Putin has allies here in America. He has allies here at the most powerful TV network. He has allies across the political spectrum, from Tulsi Gabbard on the left to Josh Hawley on the far right. And right now, Joe Biden is living up to the very best traditions of presidential leadership, honoring our values, building our alliances, standing up for the imperfect democracies around the world. Ukraine is under threat right now by a man who runs a massive kleptocracy wired into the DNA of the old KGB, the old Russian the klept. The entire exercise is in order for Putin to extend authoritarian power across to Western Europe. He is making outrageous demands. He is running a massive propaganda effort. We believe that Biden is going to need every American to stand behind him when this starts to go south, because this is a challenge to democracy, not only abroad, but here at home. And this is an ad campaign that we're very proud of, and that we believe is important for people to see, because Americans do give a damn about democracy at home and abroad. They're not asking, as the ad said, they're not asking us to fight their war. They're asking us to stand up for our values and to continue to be a voice in the international arena that opposes these extrajudicial and extra national violations of norms across the board. So, with that, we're very proud of this campaign, and a lot of folks are sharing it. We encourage you to do the same. It's on our YouTube channel, and it's on the main Lincoln Project webpage. And we encourage you to share it with your friends, because it really is Biden's going to need all of our help to stand strong and to hold the line in the coming days.
And it asks fundamental questions and requires, places an emphasis on one of the most important jobs of the president of the United States, and that's foreign policy. And back in the day, in the before times, politics used to stop at the water's edge. And I'm encouraged to see that there are sensible Republicans, at least in the Senate, who have come out and supported what Biden is doing.
Gotta give credit what credit is due.
Right, finally, but not enough, in my opinion. So thank you for that ad. And I think that's the perfect segue. Go ahead.
And one of the things about it that as a guy who was in government when the Cold War ended, when the wall came down, the last two American presidents who really had to face up against the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, never blinked.
That's right.
They never gave an inch until the Soviet system began to collapse. And at that point, we hoped for the best. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin is a virulent strain of the worst of the Soviet tradition. So with that, I think we ought to get to somebody who actually knows about Russia.
Yes. Our guest for this evening, John Cypher. He, like I said in the beginning, spent 28 years in the clandestine services, spent a little time in Moscow. John, welcome to the show. Welcome back, actually.
Nice to be here. In fact, I got my kids trying to make sure my dog stays quiet. So
it's okay. We're a pet friendly show.
Yeah. There it is.
There it is. I love it. So, John, we were really excited to have you because of your experience in this. And I think it requires someone like you that understands what Russia's doing to explain to the American people why Ukraine and why now.
Well, interesting. There's a lot there, and we'll probably get to it over the series of the questions. But Vladimir Putin's been in power for 20 years. He's developed this sort of sense of grievance, and over time, as he's become more and more of a dictator and controlled the media and the economy and everything there, he has tried to make himself the sort of leader of the anti-West. He wants to be the person that anyone who looks to, who hates immigrants and hates homosexuals and hates the West and thinks America's out of control, or he wants every dictator to come to him. He's in Latin America dealing with Ortega, and in Cuba, and he's going into Syria, and he deals with Belarus. And so I think as time has gone by, he's starting to realize that 20 years in power, his economy is not improving. Right. He's kept power because he's taken great control. He's got a bunch of cronies that he keeps rich around him. He creates a series of lies to tell the people that the problem we're not growing is because the Americans are keeping us down and the West is keeping us down. So he's created this sort of kleptocracy, corrupt organization that's sort of lying.
It's so 80s, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's very 80s.
Yeah, no, it's very 80s. I mean, it's worse. It's more than that. If you go back to the Cold War and the KGB, the things he's doing is exactly the same stuff that they did back then. And so I think, after the mess in Afghanistan, watching the politics here on January 6th and us attacking each other, realizing the Germans and French are sort of so comfortable they've forgotten that they need to fight for their democracy. I think he thought it was a time where he could maybe overthrow the system and push around, and that maybe people would back down. And I'm not someone who just automatically says great things about the administration. I think they really screwed up Afghanistan, but I think they've been masterful in the way they've communicated here, and they've kept strong, using whatever tools they can, because we came into this, like I said, weak, because we've treated Vladimir Putin as a normal leader, and we have not pushed back over the years. And so he has taken advantage of that to the point where right now we don't have a lot of those tools that we'd like to have to deter him.
John, one of the things I've been fascinated by in this thing is that the Biden administration has made a very interesting strategic decision to reveal intelligence that they're getting, mostly from technical systems, obviously. Which look, the Russians know what we have upstairs. We know what they have upstairs. But they've definitely pulled the curtain back on awareness of these false flag operations that Putin's planning. How do you think that plays in his head? Because as a former intelligence officer, Putin is almost genetically wired not to want to have anything known. But how do you think that strategy is playing out in Putin's head?
Oh, it's really interesting, and I think I think some of the mistakes they made in Afghanistan are being fixed here, and so the administration is obviously trying to put a lot of things in place to make it clear to Putin that there's real pain to be had if he moves forward, and deterring and working with allies and sending in weapons and sending troops to Europe and all of those kind of things, massive sanctions. But this is sort of an interesting playbook. It's sort of taking Putin's playbook and using it back against him, but with real information rather than disinformation and false information. So, we've used intelligence in a way to sort of keep him off balance. And what's interesting is, of course, journalists and others, they immediately jump in, like, how do we know this is true? We know in Iraq, the US government came out with information that turned out to be not true. But in this case, this information is not meant for American citizens. It's not meant for journalists to figure out. If they can, great. This is for one person. This is aimed at Vladimir Putin. This is to tell him, hey, we know your game. We're calling it out. You played this game before when you went into Georgia, when you went into Crimea, when you went into Moldova, all of these things. You play these games, you create these fake stories, these false flags. And so I think they've done a very good job of using intelligence, putting it out there to make Putin think several things, to think, oh my God, they know that. What else do they know? And like I said, I think the administration is giving good and true information because it's meant to influence Vladimir Putin. And if we put out information that Putin knew was false, it would make us even look weaker. So I think they're really trying to affect him here. And, I'm a little frustrated with, some people on the far left and the far right that they're so focused, they've spent their whole career attacking the United States, which is fine, that they've sort of moved to the place where they're calling the Americans imperialists and warmongers, that they're actually not paying attention to the real imperialist and warmonger here.
Right.
Who's looking to do massive bloodshed on the European continent and has been, committing assassinations and bounties on the heads of Americans and maybe using directed energy weapons against Americans and bombing hospitals in Syria. And he's about to take over a democratic country in Europe. And, a lot of people still can't get over trying to, criticize the United States.
Yeah, it is, to my mind, that's always been, and I think it's one of the really weird ironies now, is a lot of the lines that the American far right is echoing now were the stock in trade of the Democrats, or not of the Democrats, of certain American leftists, let me be more specific, for generations, which is, why are you threatening Putin's borders with NATO? It's the West that's the danger, all those things.
Rick, Bernie Sanders just wrote an op-ed about this.
Yeah,
right.
And it's so weird to hear the Josh Hawleys and Tucker Carlsons of the world pick up those same lines and use them in defense of Putin now.
It's just knee-jerk criticism, and I don't think they're thinking things through. I mean, this is a potentially big deal. I think people tend to think we're so used to this 24-hour news cycle that, this might happen and it won't really affect us. If there's a massive war in Europe and it's near our allies,
it never works. Well.
Yeah, wars don't go how you think they're going to go. We said we had no interest in Korea in 1950, and we ended up fighting there and stuff.
Yep.
So this is something we need to take really seriously, because it's going to really change the calculus that we've been living under for the last 30, 40 years.
And people should understand, I think, John, and tell me if you agree with this, Putin will not stop with Ukraine. He wants to restore essentially the status quo ante to the end of the Cold War, and have a lot of buffer states between him, and, in the Baltics and elsewhere, as part of his plan. This is not, Ukraine would not be the last domino to fall, if I may use a fairly infelicitous historical allusion.
And he said so, right? He's made that. He's not hiding that.
Straight that he wants to, move things back to the sort of pre-1990s. He's created this false narrative of the 1990s that the U.S. purposely humiliated and weakened Russia. Now, I lived in Russia in the 1990s. The United States and the West was actually very supportive, tried to put money in, tried to help Russia change, tried to help democratize. If there's a problem, you can argue we didn't do enough, or we didn't do it well enough. Not that we were trying to undercut or hurt Russia.
Right.
But, and so part of the problem is that the administration came in, I think, and they had misread Putin. And the Obama administration, where the vice president and the president, worked before, had misread Putin. So they came in and said, our goal with Russia is to have a stable and predictable relationship. We are focused on China.
Right.
Well, the problem is Vladimir Putin's never wanted to have a stable and predictable relationship. To him, it's a zero-sum game, and has been for the last 12 years. Anything that hurts the United States helps him. And so he's had this, he's had like a 10-year, 12-year political warfare going against the United States. And we saw it obviously in 2016 with the disinformation, the subversion, trying to support the chaos candidate to create chaos in the United States. Even now with the stuff that's happening in Ottawa, the Russians are the ones that are pushing that story more than any other media outlet.
Yep.
And so I think we misread that. We thought previous presidents, others said, if we give Putin here, if we give some concessions, if we treat him like an adult, he'll come around, it'll change. Okay, so now the administration's credit, they realized they'd screwed that up. He's never going to change. He hates the West. He hates the United States. He wants us out of Europe. He wants NATO dead. And so we need to move to a sort of almost like a Cold War states of deterrence. He will never be satisfied. Negotiations won't work because it'll just take more. We need to have the strength to make it clear to him that if he takes action against our interest, that it's going to cause him great pain. We have to deter him like we deterred Stalin, throughout the Cold War. And people always say, we don't want the Cold War, but the Cold War was successful and we never had a hot war because we pushed back. And we may not like it, but he is going to continue to do these things and continue to push. So we have to be prepared, and we have to sort of strengthen our NATO allies and sort of get some spine in the European alliance.
So, John, what does that look like? Because we hear that, and we, those of us who follow this may understand what that means. But when Americans are looking at this and they're going, "Oh my gosh, like, are we going to go to World War III in Europe over Ukraine? I can't even find that on a map." Like, what does that look like? What does a deterrent posture look like in these times in 2022?
Yeah.
And how will this impact the everyday lives of Americans?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the administration, I think, like I said, they came in with not a lot of tools because of sort of missteps in the past. And so they've tried to do everything they can to show Vladimir Putin that this is really not in his interest. It's not in his country's interest. And they've tried to pull together. So they pulled together NATO. They've tried to pull together, as many people as they can to sort of push back. They've said we're going to do, this time really drastic sanctions. Now, Russia's used to sanctions. They can sort of laugh that off, but I think they're looking at something much more strong again, pushing back money banks in the state.
What's different about these
individuals? They're going to try to stop people around Putin using money in London and England and buying houses and their banks, cutting off their use of Western banks, all of these things. We've moved more people. We have very few American troops in Europe anymore.
Right. 82nd Airborne's in Poland as of today.
Yeah. I mean, when Trump was in power, it's his own people that worked against him, but he was willing to pull us out of NATO and pull Americans out of NATO. And
didn't he want to pull us out of Germany too? Wasn't that was a big thing Trump wanted to do? He was literally doing Putin's bidding in this respect because that was exactly what Putin wanted.
Yeah. Putin really wants, what he really wants to stay in power. So that's survival.
Right.
But of those things, he wants the U.S. out of Europe. He wants NATO dead, and he wants countries on his periphery to be vassals and supplicant to Moscow. And you can argue we've pushed back to the point where all of those things he's messed up, right? So NATO was weak a year ago and looked like it might be moribund and falling apart. It is stronger and more unified and knows why it's there more than it ever has in the last 20 years. There's Americans moving back. There's American military moving back to Europe. Americans are more invested in Europe. We've been turning towards Asia for a long time. And then also, countries like Ukraine, literally in 2014, they had a prime minister who was pro-Russian. Most Ukrainian people didn't want to have a bad relationship with Russia. They were, they had friends and relatives living in Russia. Now, they understand Russia's an enemy. They are more focused on moving to the West. So all of these things are together. So why is it important to Americans? Number one, like we said before, you never know where a war is going to go. We can't just assume that this is going to be hermetically sealed in Ukraine and who cares. Mm-hmm. Number two is, we're in the process of trying to defend democracy at home. And if we can't defend democratic principles and our values overseas in something this clear with a corrupt, kleptocratic, warmongering, imperialistic government who's going to just invade over a border and blow away all UN charters and upset the whole world, the international security order, then why did NATO and these places exist? Our allies will worry about us. The Chinese will continue to think we're weak. We have to worry about China taking Taiwan. All of these kind of things. So and then just economically, it's going to affect world oil prices, energy prices. As Russia tries to deal more with China and China supports Russia's effort to sort of push back against us in the West, it makes the United States and the West look weaker and be weaker.
I think that's one of the. I think the idea that this is a choice that will ramify out well beyond the borders of Ukraine is something that I hope the administration continues to educate people on that a little bit. I do like one of your points. The pressure on the oligarchs that surround Putin, and that's sort of a weird push-pull relationship where they want to keep him happy and he wants to, use them for his various purposes. There are an awful lot of yachts in Gustavia Harbor and in Palm Beach and Miami and other places. And, the Russian kleptocracy has treated London and Miami and New York and a few other cities and Dubai as sort of a safe deposit box where they go out and they buy these expensive properties and they park their resources and their girlfriends and some of their money. I think they're more vulnerable to those things than they might think.
Right. And their kids, they send their kids to school in the West.
Oh, yeah,
so these people who are saying the most horrible things, saying, we're committing genocide and we're, Lavrov, the foreign minister, said, Americans are terrorists, all these type of things. Their kids are going to school here. They're going to school in London. Their money is in London. They own apartments and all over the West. Yeah, we need to push back against these things because Putin has created this sort of crony kleptocratic system where it's almost like, the old Russian czarist system where the boyars were,
Right.
around the czar. And if there was a war, they would have to put in some money and some troops to sort of support the czar's armies. He's sort of redone this for the 21st century. And so, Russia can never really move towards a transparent modern economy because they've created this, people around Putin get rich thing. And so those are the kind of things we can attack and affect, and at some point will affect Putin. So, because, again, I think his most important thing is survival. He's been in power 20 years. He's like any dictator. He's watched what's happened in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Egypt and Libya. He knows, like his mentor and person he looked up to, Andropov, who was in Budapest as the KGB chief, that he's working with the Hungarian intelligence service one day, and the next day they're hanging by streetlights. Those things can change really quickly. And so when you're in that kind of position of power, you have to divide and conquer. Every day you have to wake up thinking, who's after you? How do I keep myself in control? How do I keep power? How do I save my money? All of those type of things. And so we need to be in a position over time to threaten those things, to push back. He claims we're messing in his internal affairs. We're not, but we could.
Right.
I just want to point something out that you said, John. The name Sergei Lavrov might sound familiar to some people. This is the same guy, correct me if I'm wrong, that was laughing it up with President Trump at the time in the Oval Office.
That's right.
Yeah, despicable. Okay. That's why so many people who were foreign policy experts and folks who understand the dynamics were so horrified by that scene of them just whooping it up like they're good old pals in the Oval Office here in the U.S. They are not our friends. In the last
few, a quick example about
Lavrov.
He's their foreign minister, has been for a long time. He's the one that yesterday called the Americans terrorists and said, they should fight against us. Two things he's done recently that show that, how just nasty this man is. There was a false disinformation campaign in Germany that the Russian intelligence put out that a young German girl was raped by North African Arabs in Germany. This is fake information that was put out, but it created violence, brought people to the streets, started beating and killing, immigrants. And Lavrov, the foreign minister, took this information, spun it up, said it's true, put it out that it's true, supporting essentially a covert disinformation campaign where people died. And secondly, recently, when they went back into Libya after Gaddafi went in, he was interviewed and they said, well, which one of these factions here in Libya do you support? And he said, I don't know, whichever one the Americans are against.
Of course. Right. That's right. And to that point, we have a few minutes with you left. And I wanted to ask you a couple things about what's happening on the ground right now. As we hear these news reports coming out and we see these satellite photos of bridges being built between Belarus and Ukraine, and part of the disinformation campaign coming out of Russia, these ideas of false flag operations to give them the rationalization for the invasion. What about the cyber attacks? Like, it feels like what would be considered like a war in Ukraine now may look a little different than what we've seen before. Yes, there will be, if they do this, that you will see tanks and, traditional things, but there's other ways, right, that Putin can make problems in Ukraine besides just kinetic war.
Yeah, a couple points there. One is, a lot of the journalists are out there sort of say, hey, the people in Ukraine don't seem as worked up as you guys in America seem about this type of thing. And one of the reasons is they've been at this war for 8 years.
Right.
The Russians took over Crimea. They moved into the Donbass. 15 to 20,000 Ukrainians have already died. And there's been a nonstop covert war to destabilize the government. They've taken down banks with cyber attacks. They've been doing this stuff, disinformation nonstop since that point. They're used to it. They understand it. And it's continuing daily. The second thing is, again, back in our sort of 24-hour, what is the thing that's happening now? Is it going to end tomorrow? If he pulls back, is it over? The thing we got to remember here is we got to move towards a more mature deterrence thing to realize this is not something that's going to end tomorrow. We all just go back and it's going to be great. Vladimir Putin has the ability to do this over and over again. He can say he's pulling back tomorrow. He can continue to pressure Ukraine. He can continue to undermine Ukraine. He can continue to do these, fake attacks in Ukraine. He has a gun to their head, and he can move troops, up and down as he's done over the last year and keep this going. And so we need to start thinking about what is our long-term interest. How do we put together a plan where we've made it clear that, until you are serious about working with us, and we don't think you ever will be, Mr. Putin, we are going to deter you, and we're going to put things in place to make it clear that, the Western alliance will stand up, it will push back, and it will cause you pain, economic and perhaps military pain. And so, I think a lot of people are just waiting for what is the key piece of information that this makes this end. We need to start thinking about it in a sort of bigger way.
Well, John, thank you so much for tonight.
Wait, Rick, we can't let him go yet. We can't let him go yet. I have one question. There's no way that I'm going to allow a clandestine officer to not answer this question for me. For those who are fans of the Americans, how real is it?
The Americans I was one. So I have a company now called Spycraft. We're making movies. We're making TV shows. We're doing this kind of stuff out in Hollywood with a number of writers and producers and directors, and we're having a grand time of it. But the Americans was one of my favorites. Most spy things are sort of silly. They put them in the action genre, and so it's all cars and things blowing up. Whereas, most espionage is much more about trust, betrayal, sort of those type of things. The Americans is interesting. I worked, on sort of our worldwide clandestine Russia program. And so I was in there when we were monitoring those Russian illegals that were in the United States. So illegals there's Russian spies sort of in the Russian embassy that pretend to be diplomats. But then there's a whole series of people who have covers as Americans and Canadians and South Americans and things that are sort of deep cover. They're there for longer term sabotage. They're over to take over really sensitive cases if the ones in the embassy are under FBI scrutiny or something like this. So I was involved in working with the FBI as we monitored those guys and then arrested them in 2010. That led to the TV show The Americans. The Americans is one of the ones that the notion of the mentality, how you think undercover, how you have to deal in that life is more realistic than any of. Now, the fact that they're murdering people and they're running around Washington and shooting up people, that stuff's all silly.
Right.
But the sort of underlying current of The Americans, I think, is great.
Well, Rick, that Michelle and Barbara who watch it are now going to be even more paranoid than they were before because they there's folks on our team who are big fans of the show, and it impacted them where they're looking around like, well, could it be them? Could it be them? So I wanted to make sure that I asked
him in that program. So he was sort of a mid-tier, second-tier KGB officer. Never made it to the West. He worked in East Germany. It was his best thing. But they've now created this sort of false story that he was deeply involved in running illegals. And
of course,
since the Bolshevik days, they've taken great pride in having, because in the communist days, they had Americans, everybody that moved to Russia and the Soviet Union that they could put back into countries. It's sort of this underground reserve. And so Putin likes to say, they pretend like he was involved in the illegals program. I don't think it's true, but they still take it very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So would Black Widow be considered one of the silly things? Is that I have to ask that. I mean, if Americans is cool,
I'll watch it and I'll let you know.
John, we appreciate you and your expertise. And if you had a final word to the American people about what does a win look like in this situation, what would it be? As everyone's a little on edge about what's going to happen over there.
A win is not a war, and starting to learn that this sort of low-grade, covert, ugly war will continue, and we have to take it seriously.
Smart words from a smart guy with lots of experience.
Absolutely.
John Cypher, thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us tonight, John. We appreciate you very much.
My pleasure. Great talking to you guys. Love your stuff.
Thanks again.
Keep up the great work. John is so cool. He's such a smooth, just like badass guy.
Yeah,
They're always the coolest.
He can play by the Moscow rules and survive it,
Yes, for that long. And at that time, there was a lot going on. So, all right. Well, that is it for our show tonight. And I want to reiterate that you can hang out with Rick and Reed in the Fuck Around and Find Out Instagram Live coming up at 8 o'clock. There's a lot of stuff going on besides just Ukraine that I'm sure you and Reed will have a lovely time kvetching about.
We're about to get on the Instagram Live right now, kids. All right,
Yes.
thanks guys. Amen.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.